These trains are selling for pennies on the dollar, some practically given away for scrap value. But there's a reason transit agencies are running away from them faster than passengers already did. Which cursed machine topped our list? We're counting down 10 trains that are ridiculously cheap to buy, yet rail operators treat them like radioactive cargo. From commuter carriages that shake passengers like paint cans to diesel units that spew fumes into their own cabins, each entry proves that in the railway world you absolutely get what you pay for. These aren't vintage collectibles waiting for restoration. They're operational nightmares that turned budget-friendly into career-ending, which condemned rolling stock claimed the crown as the most unwanted train in modern history. Let's find out. If you want to see more videos about old trains that outlasted everything modern, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another video. Number 10. British Rail Class 142 Pacer. Meet the city. Class 142. Pacer, the train that answered a question nobody asked. What if we put a bus body on railway wheels and called it progress? In the 1980s, British Rail needed cheap trains fast. Instead of engineering proper rail vehicles, they took Leyland bus bodies, bolted them to rail bogies, and shipped them out to northern England. The result was predictable. The Pacer rides like a shopping cart with a broken wheel. The four-wheel design, lifted straight from road vehicles, has no suspension worth mentioning. Every rail joint sends a shudder through the cabin. Passengers describe a 30-minute journey as feeling like riding a pneumatic drill. The vibration is so severe that regular commuters report numbness in their legs. The noise is equally punishing. Without proper soundproofing, the engine roar fills the cabin at conversation-killing volumes. The windows rattle in their frames. Metal panels buzz and hum. It's not a passenger experience. It's an endurance test. Northern Rail operated these units until 2020, long past their intended 15-year lifespan, because they were too cheap to retire. Now they're being scrapped en masse. A few preservation societies grab some for historical value, but even museums hesitate. Nobody wants to restore a train that was barely acceptable when it was new. You can find Class 142 units listed for £15,000 to £30,000, assuming anyone wants them. Most are heading straight to the scrapyard where they'll fetch more value as metal than as trains. The Pacer proved that cutting corners doesn't just compromise comfort. It creates machines that everyone, passengers and operators alike, wants to forget. Number 9. SNCB NMBS AM96 Break. Belgium's AM96 commuter trains earned a nickname that tells you everything. Break, as in breakdown. Ordered in the 1990s as a modern replacement for aging stock, these trains were supposed to bring Belgian rail into the new millennium. Instead, they brought maintenance crews to their knees. The AM96's electronic system is the primary culprit. Multiple computer control units manage everything from doors to brakes, but they communicate through a network that fails with disturbing regularity. When one module glitches, it can bring down the entire system. Trains stop dead on the tracks, doors refuse to open, or worse, refuse to close. Morning commuters became intimately familiar with the announcement. Technical difficulties with the AM96. The electrical failures compound in winter. Cold weather wreaks havoc on the poorly designed wiring harnesses. Snow infiltrates connection points that should have been sealed. The heating system, controlled by those same unreliable electronics, cuts out precisely when passengers need it most. Riders sit in freezing carriages while the train limps toward the next station. Belgian rail operator SNCB NMBS spent millions trying to fix the fleet. Software updates, hardware replacements, complete system overhauls, nothing worked long-term. The trains that were supposed to run for 30 years became hangar queens before they turned 15. Now they're being retired early. SNCB would rather invest in new trains than continue throwing money at the AM96's problems. Surplus units are available for remarkably low prices, £50,000 to $100,000 for a complete train set. But buyer beware, the maintenance costs will dwarf the purchase price within months. The AM96 is a bargain the same way a yacht with a hole in it is a bargain. Technically cheap, functionally ruinous. Number 8. New York City R32 subway cars. The R32 subway cars served New York City for an astonishing 60 years, from 1964 to 2022. They were workhorses, survivors, icons of the NYC subway system. They're also loud, uncomfortable, and technologically obsolete in ways that make them unsellable to anyone but scrappers. The R32's design is pure 1960s functionality: corrugated stainless steel shells, slam-action doors, and a propulsion system that screams through the tunnels like an industrial blender. There's no air conditioning, not because it broke, but because it was never installed. Summer rides turned the cars into mobile saunas, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees. Passengers fainted. Windows that could actually open became prized positions. The noise level inside an R32 is genuinely damaging. The steel wheels on steel rails create a continuous roar that peaks at over 100 decibels during curves and braking. That's louder than a chainsaw. After decades of operation, the noise only got worse as the wheels and track wore down. Riders developed coping strategies: earplugs, noise-canceling headphones, or simply accepting the temporary hearing loss. Modern accessibility requirements are the final nail in the R32's coffin. There are no wheelchair ramps, no level boarding compatibility, no announcements for the hearing impaired. The gap between platform and train is wide enough to trap a foot. For any transit agency trying to meet 21st century standards, the R32 is a non-starter. New York City retired the last R32s with ceremony and nostalgia, then promptly sent them to be recycled. A few went to museums. The rest were dumped in the Atlantic Ocean to create artificial reefs. That's not a joke. The MTA literally sunk them because nobody else wanted them. If you somehow found one for sale, you'd pay maybe $5,000 for 50 tons of vintage steel. And then you'd spend $500,000 retrofitting it to be remotely usable. Number 7. Renfe 592 series, Spain. Spain's Renfe 592 series looked good on paper. Modern diesel multiple units for rural and secondary routes built in the early 1990s by Siemens and Kiev. In practice, they became the trains that Spanish maintenance crews learned to hate. The 592's downfall is its parts supply chain, or rather, the absence of one. Siemens used components that were either proprietary or became discontinued within a decade. When a transmission controller fails, you can't just order a replacement. You have to find a donor train, cannibalize the part, or wait months for a custom rebuild. This turned routine maintenance into archaeological expeditions. The braking system introduces another layer of misery. The 592 uses a pneumatic system with electronic controls, a hybrid design that combines the worst aspects of both technologies. Air leaks are common, triggering safety shutdowns. The electronic controllers interpret these leaks as catastrophic failures, locking the brakes and stranding the train. Passengers wait while crews manually bleed the system, a process that can take an hour. Fuel economy is surprisingly terrible for a modern diesel unit. The 592 burns through diesel at a rate that makes older, less efficient trains look frugal. Operating costs per kilometer exceeded budget projections by 40%, turning these economical units into money pits. Renfe began phasing out the 592 series as soon as newer trains became available. Some units were sold to private operators in Eastern Europe who quickly regretted the decision. Others sit in storage yards, too expensive to maintain, too complicated to sell. You might find a two for $200,000, which sounds reasonable until you realize the first major breakdown will cost you that much again. The 592 is a reminder that sometimes the cheap option is the one nobody can afford to keep running. Number 6. British Rail Class 153. The Class 153 is the loneliest train in Britain. Born from the carcasses of two-car Class 155 units, these single-car diesel units were created in the 1990s as a cost-saving measure. Take two carriages, split them apart, add a driver's cab to each end, and suddenly you have twice as many trains. Brilliant except for one thing: nobody wants to ride alone in a train built for solitude. The single-car design means cramped capacity. A Class 153 holds about 70 passengers in a space that feels more like a corridor than a carriage. During peak hours, the standing room fills immediately. Passengers press against each other in a narrow aisle between seats that seem designed for children. There are no luggage racks worth mentioning. Bicycles? Forget it. The ride quality is punishing in a different way than the Pacer. The Class 153 is light, too light. Without the weight of a second carriage to stabilize it, the train rocks and sways on anything but perfectly maintained track. Curves feel like carnival rides. Crosswinds push the carriage sideways, creating an unsettling sense that you might tip over. Acoustics are another disaster. The engine sits directly below the passenger compartment with minimal sound insulation. Every acceleration sounds like you're sitting inside the motor. Conversations require shouting. Phone calls are impossible. Rural operators in Wales and southwest England still run Class 153s because they're cheap to operate on low traffic routes, but passengers hate them. Complaints focus on overcrowding, noise, and the general indignity of riding what feels like a train that was designed as punishment. Used Class 153 units sell for £50,000 to £100,000, but most operators would rather invest in newer bi-mode units. The 153 is cheap because it's a compromise that satisfies nobody, not the operator, not the passenger, and certainly not anyone looking to buy one second-hand. Number 5. Ferrovie dello Stato ALE 426, Italy. Italy's ALE 426 electric multiple units served from the 1940s through the early 2000s, an impressive run for any train. But longevity doesn't equal desirability, especially when those decades were spent punishing passengers with design choices that felt outdated by 1960. The AL 426's seats are the stuff of legends, bad legends. Wooden benches with minimal padding arranged in rigid rows that offer no lumbar support and no comfort for journeys longer than 15 minutes. Italian commuters nicknamed them the torture devices. The seats don't recline, don't adjust, and seem specifically engineered to ensure you arrive at your destination with lower back pain. Ventilation is theatrical in its inadequacy. Small windows provide the only airflow, and they open just enough to tease you with the possibility of relief. On summer days, the metal body absorbs heat like a greenhouse, turning the interior into a stifling oven. Passengers packed into these trains during July and August experience conditions that would violate modern transit standards. The electrical system operates on antiquated technology. The motor controllers are loud, inefficient, and prone to sparking. The distinct smell of ozone and hot metal fills the cabin during acceleration. It's not dangerous exactly, but it's unnerving enough to make first-time riders wonder if they should be concerned. After retirement, dozens of L46 units were sold to private tourist railways and heritage operations. They sound romantic until you realize that heritage operation often means we have no budget for real trains. Most buyers discovered that maintaining 1940s electrical systems in the 2020s is expensive, frustrating, and requires knowledge that died with the original engineers. You can find ALE 426 units for $20,000 to $50,000, assuming the seller is desperate. But restoration costs run into the hundreds of thousands. The ALE 426 is cheap because it's a museum, piece that even museums think twice about accepting. It's a train for people who romanticize the past but haven't actually tried sitting on those wooden benches for 3 hours. Number 4. SNCF X2800, France. France's X2800 diesel railcars were built in the 1950s for rural branch lines, and they served admirably for decades. But by the 2000s, they'd become rolling violations of every environmental and safety regulation introduced since their construction. The X2800 isn't just unwanted, it's actively offensive to modern standards. The diesel engine sits inside the passenger compartment, separated by a thin partition that does nothing to contain the fumes. During operation, exhaust leaks into the cabin. The smell is constant, a mix of diesel, oil, and exhaust that clings to clothes and hair. Passengers exit these trains smelling like they just worked a shift in a bus garage. The health implications are obvious and alarming. Prolonged exposure to diesel fumes causes headaches, nausea, and respiratory irritation. For anyone with asthma or other respiratory conditions, riding an S2800 is medically inadvisable. The ventilation system, such as it exists, merely circulates the contaminated air rather than replacing it. Noise inside the cabin is industrial grade. The engine's proximity means every mechanical sound is amplified. Conversations are shouted, music is pointless. The experience is less charming rural train ride and more trapped in a shed with a running engine. Environmental regulations have made the X2800 a pariah. Modern emissions standards classify these trains as mobile pollution sources. Operating them on public railways requires special exemptions that most transit authorities won't grant. Even private heritage railways hesitate because the public relations nightmare of running a diesel fume spewing train isn't worth the nostalgia factor. SNCF retired the last X2800 units in the mid-2000s. Some were sold to collectors for $10,000 to $30,000. Most were scrapped immediately. The few that remain operational are curiosities operated sparingly and only on isolated tourist lines where environmental enforcement is lax. The X2800 is cheap because it's essentially illegal to run in any context where people might actually need to travel. Number 3. Deutsche Bahn, Class 624. Germany's Class 624 diesel multiple units should have been reliable. They were built by reputable manufacturers, designed for regional service, and entered operation in the late 1990s with reasonable expectations. Instead, they became Deutsche Bahn's cautionary tale about premature technology adoption. The Class 624's hydraulic transmission is the root of most problems. Unlike electric or mechanical transmissions, hydraulic systems use fluid pressure to transfer power from the engine to the wheels. In theory, this provides smooth acceleration. In practice, it provides constant failures. The hydraulic fluid overheats, seals leak, and pressure drops trigger emergency shutdowns. Trains stop mid-route, sometimes multiple times per journey. The heating and cooling systems share the hydraulic fluid system, creating a cascading failure scenario. When the transmission fails, the climate control fails. Winter passengers freeze while waiting for repairs. Summer, passengers swelter. Either way, the experience is miserable. Maintenance schedules for the Class 624 are punishing. The hydraulic system requires monitoring and service intervals that are 2 to 3 times more frequent than comparable diesel trains. Parts wear out faster than anticipated. Every regional operator that received Class 624 units quickly realized they'd bought someone else's problem. Deutsche Bahn began retiring the Class 624 after barely 20 years of service, half its projected lifespan. Some units were sold to private operators in Eastern Europe who experienced the same reliability nightmares. Others went to regional operators in Germany who couldn't afford newer trains and accepted the maintenance burden as the price of having any trains at all. You'll find Class 624 units listed for $150,000 to $300,000, which sounds like a deal for a modern diesel unit until you factor in the maintenance. One operator calculated that annual upkeep costs 60% more than tow. Equivalent trains, the Class 624 is cheap because keeping it running is expensive and nobody wants that kind of commitment. Number 2. Amtrak Viewliner. Sleeping cars. Amtrak's Viewliner, sleeping cars, built in the 1990s, promised comfortable overnight travel for long-distance passengers. They delivered a sleeping experience that left passengers wishing they'd flown instead. The Viewliner I is proof that good intentions and poor execution create trains that nobody wants, even at bargain prices. The toilet and room design is the most notorious feature. Each sleeping compartment includes a toilet, not in a separate bathroom, but in the room itself, separated from the bed by a thin curtain. The privacy implications are obvious and horrifying. Families, couples, even strangers assigned to share rooms face the awkward reality of using a toilet inches from where someone else was trying to sleep. The smell was inevitable. Ventilation couldn't keep up with the biological realities of enclosed spaces. Chemical deodorants masked nothing. By morning, rooms carried an odor that permeated bedding and luggage. Passengers complained bitterly. Reviews savaged the design. Amtrak's reputation for overnight service took a hit that lasted years. The upper berth design adds another layer of discomfort. To maximize capacity, Viewliner I cars include fold-down berths above the main bed. These upper berths are coffin-like, narrow, low-ceilinged, with barely enough room to turn over. Claustrophobic passengers avoid them entirely. Even the adventurous report feeling entombed. Noise isolation is non-existent, wheels clacking on rails, other passengers moving through corridors, and the perpetual hum of the HVAC system create a sonic environment where sleep requires earplugs or resignation. Light leaks through curtains and door seams, ensuring that every station stop illuminates your compartment like a searchlight found you. Amtrak built 50 Viewliner Y sleeping cars and quickly regretted it. The Viewliner Xi was a series, introduced in the 2010s, eliminated the in-room toilets and improved virtually every other aspect. The Viewliner I cars are being phased out as quickly as replacements become available. Their resale value is essentially zero. No private operator wants sleeping cars with toilets in the rooms. Even for parts, they're worth less than the metal they're made from. If you could buy a Viewliner I, it might cost $100,000, but you'd spend that much again removing the toilets and rebuilding the rooms into something passengers might tolerate. The Viewliner I is cheap because it's a rolling reminder of design hubris and everybody knows it. Number 1. Bombardier Talent 1, first generation. The Bombardier Talent 1 takes the crown as the most unwanted cheap train in modern history. Built in the late 1990s and early 2000s as a modular, cost-effective solution for regional rail, the Talent 1 became a case study in how not to build a train. Every cost-cutting measure, every design shortcut, and every engineering compromise created problems that transformed these units into pariahs. The structural integrity issues appeared almost immediately. The Talent 1 uses a lightweight aluminum body, which sounds efficient until stress cracks start appearing in the frame after just a few years of service. The articulated design, where carriages share bogies to save weight and cost, magnified the problem. Forces that would normally distribute across separate carriages concentrated at the articulation points, causing metal fatigue that required constant monitoring and repair. The bogie design itself is a masterclass in poor engineering. The shared bogies were supposed to reduce maintenance costs by cutting the number of wheel sets. Instead, they created a maintenance nightmare. When one bogie develops problems, it affects multiple carriages. Replacing or servicing a shared bogie requires taking half the train out of service. The design that was meant to save money ended up costing far more in downtime and labor. The door system earned the Talent 1 particular infamy. Sliding plug doors were chosen for their modern appearance and supposed reliability. They failed constantly. Sensors misread conditions, doors jammed halfway, or worst of all, they opened between stations at speed. Multiple incidents of doors opening unexpectedly led to emergency service bulletins and expensive retrofits. Passengers learned to stand away from the doors, treating them like potential threats rather than exits. Interior climate control operates on a binary logic that defies reason: too hot or too cold, with no middle ground. The HVAC system seems calibrated for a different climate entirely. Summer passengers swelter while the air conditioning struggles to make any impact. Winter passengers freeze because the heating system cycles on and off based on sensors that consistently misread cabin temperature. The result is a constantly uncomfortable environment where passengers dress in layers and hope for the best. The noise levels inside a Talent 1 are unacceptable for any train built after 1970, let alone the 2000s. The aluminum body panels amplify rather than dampen sound. Every acceleration, every brake application, every rail joint creates noise that fills the cabin. Add the rattling panels, the squeaking bogies, and the groaning articulation joints, and you have a rolling orchestra of irritation. The ride quality combines the worst aspects of lightweight construction with poorly designed suspension. The train pitches and rocks on anything but a perfectly maintained track. Curves induce a swaying motion that makes reading difficult and nausea common. The lightweight body means every gust of wind translates into sideways movement that passengers feel viscerally. Multiple European rail operators who bought Talent 1 units began retiring them after just 15 to 20 years, less than half their intended lifespan. The maintenance costs, the reliability issues, the passenger complaints, all of it added up to a fleet that nobody wanted to operate anymore. Private rail companies that bought them secondhand quickly discovered why the original owners were so eager to sell. The resale market for Talent 1 units is a graveyard. Units sell for $100,000 to $200,000, sometimes less, depending on condition and desperation. But that purchase price is meaningless next to the maintenance costs. One operator calculated that keeping a Talent 1 fleet operational cost 80% more than equivalent trains from other manufacturers. Parts availability is a constant problem. Bombardier's support for first-generation talent units is minimal, leaving operators to fabricate solutions or cannibalize donor trains. Talent One's failure goes beyond technical problems. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes a train successful: reliability, comfort, and total cost of ownership. Bombardier learned expensive lessons from the Talent One, lessons that improved later generations. But those lessons came at the expense of operators and passengers who suffered through a decade of problematic trains. Today, Talent One units are being scrapped, sold for parts, or dumped on third-tier operators who have no better options. Museums show minimal interest. The Talent One isn't old enough to be historically significant and isn't successful enough to be worth preserving. It exists in a limbo of unwantedness, too recent to be vintage, too flawed to be useful. Talent One is cheap because it's a mistake on wheels, and everyone knows it. It's the train that taught the industry that cutting costs without cutting corners requires wisdom that can't be rushed.